Any governor who serves 4 terms is going to be remembered for a lot of things. I think in Edwards' case, mostly it will be that he was the most talented and most controversial governor in Louisiana history, certainly its modern history. He was charming, charismatic, always entertaining, and people loved him for that. He also was so talented that even his foes acknowledged his political abilities. He could bring disparate sides together and forge a compromise. And he had tremendous personal skills in dealing with difficult political issues. Of course, the corruption of the riverboat licensing scandal will always be part of his legacy. He cannot escape that, but it's only a part of his legacy. The Constitution of 1974 is a huge contribution that Edwards gave to the state of Louisiana. Without him, we would not have had the Constitutional Convention in 1973, and the voters might not have approved that Constitution in 1974. And it was a significant, a vast improvement over the old 1921 Constitution. And speaking of political skills, his political skills were unmatched, not only in his era, but before or since. He had a tremendous ability to bring disparate parties together to find a compromise, and he had the political skills to push through very difficult bills and difficult programs that other governors might have struggled with or failed at doing. Now, some politicians need to learn how to be governor after they get elected. Edwin Edwards was one of a kind. He knew how to be governor the minute he took his oath of office, and he was never afraid or bashful about using the tremendous powers of his office to get things done. And I think that's what people will remember most about him. He got things done.